Hi everyone, we are TD02 Group B from GEI 1000, and today we are walking through our Libya shelter intervention project, one roof at a time. So first up, some background information about what is happening in Libya. This is Twati, an 80-year-old mother living in Tripoli. Because of the ongoing conflict in Libya, she and her daughter have been forced to sleep outdoors with no stable shelter. Also, another case coming back from the Libyan Red Crescent, LRC volunteer, reflecting that the storm Daniel has affected Dana severely, which is also one of the volunteers. So after seeing all these cases in the context of Libya, where we will be providing help, circumstances is challenging due to ongoing war and see over 120,000 displacement. Natural disasters such as Storm Daniel also result in loss of proper shelter and needs, hence exacerbating the issue of shelter displacement.
So, given the situation, who do we help first? In general, our team's classification model helps to determine the most vulnerable populations, the most urgent help required, and how and when for the allocation of resources. Given the criteria, our team has created 3 categories: high, medium, and low risk. The important factors we have considered are shown. First, we accounted for the total number of migrants in each muhalla, where highest populations are focused on, as we are abiding by utilitarianism to benefit the most in volunteerism. We also focused on shelter in priority need 1, where we accounted for data collected from ground-up conversations. This allows us to access and focus on the population itself. Another factor is the priority need problem of not sufficiently available. Even though the data provided is vague with no definition of sufficient, we define sufficient as quantitatively enough, equating to people without existing housing. We also ignored too expensive, which is many people without cheap housing. Thus, this translates into our first abstracted column, priority need 1 of shelter plus priority need problem of not sufficiently available.
So in the data set, the shelter types given are actually so many, thus it's very hard to look at, and we decided to combine them into 2 different categories, depending on the fact whether they're sufficient for safe and comfortable housing or not. So we have inadequate, which refers to squatting, abandoned buildings, shelter in workplaces, and then we have adequate, which are rented accommodations, even though we do acknowledge that these accommodations may not be qualitatively sufficient. Then after that, we created one abstracted column, which is the muhallas that have more inadequate than adequate sheltering. Next, migrant crises are often very long. Less than 1 in 40 are resolved within 3 years. This is what the residences of Tarweha after military attacks in 2011 faced. And even those who have returned have insufficient housing, with no windows, electricity, and water. Thus, we decided to make migrants' arrival time our third abstracted column and mark these muhallas as urgent if there are more people who have arrived more than 12 months ago. This means we prioritize those who have suffered the most in these crises. Unfortunately, some of our data is unclear, thus we decided to mark them as the longer possible time, which is more than 12 months. For our fourth abstracted column, which is more than 500 women and children in the migrant population, we will elaborate later on why this is significant and why we chose this threshold for these vulnerable populations. Lastly, we decided to ignore a few factors, first of which is nationality, because we want to abide by the humanitarian principle of impartiality. Lastly, we also decided to ignore permit status. Now, what if those with work permits actually have the opportunity and financial ability to work and afford housing more? While this is not necessarily the case, migrants in Libya actually take on more hands-on, low-skilled labor. They also face increased risk of job insecurity, employees paying less than promised, or delayed payment. And even with residential permits, housing is still unstable, which is why we decided to ignore permits as a whole.
Here, our tree diagram shows how our group has systematically evaluated each site through 4 key factors. First, we chose vulnerable population concentration and displacement duration as the most critical indicators. Vulnerable populations such as women and children should be prioritized for shelter assistance. We have set the threshold of 500 women and children representing the 85th percentile, thus capturing the top 15% of sites with the highest concentrations of vulnerable populations. Among these sites, individuals with the longest displacement duration are classified as high need. Next, we layer in self-reported urgency and shelter adequacy. Shelter adequacy was identified as critical as migrants' vulnerability is intensified when faced with significant barriers to accessing housing resources. Consequently, this impacts their social integration, health outcomes, and employment opportunities. By incorporating self-reported urgency, sites with fewer migrants can also be classified as high need if migrants identify shelter as their main concern and inadequate shelters outnumber adequate ones. This creates a validation mechanism, ensuring our model reflects objective data and community voices. Sites which are not in high need are evaluated by population scale. For instance, muhallas exceeding 700 people or 500 women and children are classified as medium need. With these thresholds prioritizing vulnerable populations while maximizing reach, we could balance fairness and effectiveness for the most optimal humanitarian impact. With our model's classification, we believe that 21 high-need muhallas are a manageable figure for immediate intervention, while the medium-need muhallas can also be addressed through subsequent aid deployment.
60% of our budget, or $300,000, will go to the 21 high-need mohallas. These areas have large vulnerable populations and face chronic long-term displacement. To ensure stability, we'll invest in semi-permanent shelters such as container housing that safeguards health, safety, and dignity over time. Examples include mohallas like Talaba and Al Samani Al Gharbi, where there is dire need for shelter. This aligns with UNHCR and OECD, which shows that over 62% of humanitarian budgets are typically directed towards high-needs refugee sites requiring long-term shelter. Next, 20% of our budget, or $100,000, will go to the medium-need baladias to protect women and children. Here, we'll deploy semi-permanent large-capacity shelter unit per 12 baladias identified for the more vulnerable to seek shelter in if needed. They will be placed in strategic locations such as rural mohallas or nearing to mohallas with high numbers of women and children. We are grounding this in WHO and humanitarian data which documents the heightened vulnerability of women and children in displacement contexts. Then, 15% or $75,000 is allocated for staffing and logistics. We'll hire paid experts for emergency management and oversight, while volunteers support less critical tasks to maximize efficiency. This mixed staffing model is backed by NRC evidence, which emphasizes balanced teams for operational effectiveness in displacement crisis. Finally, 5% or $25,000 will serve as an emergency contingency fund for unforeseen costs, rapid response, and migrant transport. This ensures uninterrupted operation and supply chain flexibility consistent with Red Cross and NRC standards, which recommend maintaining a 5 to 10% contingency for crisis resilience.
In our model, we focus on a data-driven approach to offer an objective, unbiased method of determining who should receive aid. However, data alone may overlook what individuals themselves view as essential. With these considerations, it is important to ensure that help is not only effective, but also respectful and humane. Our team incorporates the humanitarian principles endorsed by the United Nations to guide the design of our model. Since housing is the primary resource provided, we prioritize areas with more inadequate shelters and higher proportion of women and children to meet urgent needs. We also consider migrant arrival time to reflect partiality, prioritizing those facing prolonged displacement, and population size to uphold neutrality. Collectively, these factors translate humanitarian principles into measurable actions, bridging ethics and evidence to deliver aid. However, using migrant arrival time may not fully capture the current urgency of displacement. We also identified a narrow gap between urgent and non-urgent variables, with 3 mantikas, like as urgent, only have 1 more inadequate shelter than adequate ones. To mitigate this, we cross-validate between different factors, ensuring more underlying areas are reassessed and no community is deprioritized due to marginal differences. Scale inconsistency may also arise between mohalla level and mantika level. While mohalla level data provides local details, it can fragment the broader picture. For example, Al Jabbar Al Atta and Al Jabbar Al Ghabi shows higher concentration of inadequate shelters. We therefore analyze at a mohalla level for aggregating at mantika level, ensuring both local accuracy and regional consistency.
To end off, we believe that helping cannot be done casually and must be through careful planning and listening. Thus, we aim to do good and help others in a way that is resourceful and beneficial. This Pluto quote depicts our mindset. Thank you and goodbye.